you.
Thank you to those of you that are joining the webinar now. We'll probably make a start in about 2 or 3 minutes, as it says on the screen. So we'll just have silence for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get going. Thank you. Thank you to those of you that are joining the webinar now. We'll just hold off for a couple of minutes to let those latecomers join us. So just be quiet for a couple of minutes. Thank you. As time is of the essence, I think we'll make a start. So welcome to this webinar on placemaking, again looking furthermore at the themes in the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking. We've got a really good panel for you today. I'm just going to quickly run through the Zoom instructions. So we're running this session as a webinar. You can interact with it either by raising your hand. There's a raise your hand function at the bottom. So if you did have a question at any of the Q&A points, we're going to have the panelists delivering presentations back to back, and then we'll have an extended sort of Q&A discussion. So that's a good time for you to sort of put anything in the Q&A or the chat, or you can even raise your hand. So put any of your queries as the presentations go along in the chat. I'm Tom, I'm from the IPM, and playing this hosting role for you. And with that, I'll pass over to Kari, who's just going to introduce the session.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for everybody for being here today. It's really great to see you all, and thanks to our panelists in advance for their time and their insights and what they have to say today. So this session is around this book, the Routledge Handbook of Placemaking, and those of us in the room have all had a role to play in this book. And one thing that was really clear when I was bringing the book together was just the wealth of experience of informal and informal education, teaching, guidance, mentorship of placemaking. And as somebody that found my way into this sector really just by following my own curiosity, how placemaking is taught and the pedagogies behind it is something I find really fascinating, because it isn't something I had an experience of to bring me into the placemaking sector. And I think all the more so as placemaking really finds its place in an urban place, sector, and as it comes to the fore in so much of the considerations around what it is we want our places to be now and in the future, the education of that, wherever it may take place, is absolutely imperative. So we've got three speakers here that are not only in their own ways fantastic placemakers, but they are all involved in the teaching and learning of placemaking in some different way. They come from different purviews into that. I should say as well, I say teaching and learning is quite a perhaps clunky and not necessarily helpful binary, but I hope you get my gist when I'm using that as a phrase. Each of the panelists will have around 10 minutes to talk through their own practice, throw some questions out to us, whichever way they want to take it. And then we will open up into a Q&A with each other and with yourselves, and open up to a general conversation. We've got up to an hour and a half for the session today. And quite often with these sessions, we have gone slightly over the hour. I would apologise in advance to say I have a hard stop at 6 p.m. because I have a personal matter to go to. But you are in safe hands with everybody here, and with Tom, who's expert at running these sessions now as well. So for me, one of the points of this session is, aside from gaining insight into the practices of Jason, Anita and Tom, I'm keen to explore what's good about placemaking in teaching and learning, and in this praxis of that, and the format that we have for that at the moment. And also what's, I guess, very much the aim of the handbook is to ask, what more is needed? What do we lean into with what we've got now to take us, to take us into the future of placemaking? And I guess in that is also, what are the gaps? Who else needs to be in that classroom, for want of a better term? And how do we work with each other and with different voices in this endeavour of teaching and learning placemaking? There's also, I think, something for me, and perhaps this just speaks to my root of curiosity into placemaking. I'm really keen to know from those in the room, what's your experience of being a student of placemaking or being a teacher of placemaking? I think of placemaking as something which is really experiential out in the field. So how can we bring that into the classroom? How does that inform how you study? How does that inform how you teach? I'll put that into the question slot in a moment as well. Please do add any questions or thoughts, comments that you've got into the chat function, and Tom and I will moderate, we'll gather those and pose those back to the panel when we get to that point in the session. But we also invite you to come in and ask those questions directly as well. We'll get to that in a moment. So we're going to start off with Tom Burrup. If you want to go and start. Tom edited as section editor of one of the handbook sections and does absolutely incredible work. But I'm not going to paraphrase or pass what Tom does. That's I wouldn't do it justice. So over to you, Tom.
Tom, you're just on mute before you go any further.
I'm so sorry. That's going to be what we repeat for years and years about you're muted, you're muted. Anyway, I was very pleased to have this invitation to gather some of my own thinking and put it together in a presentation on how I go about doing the teaching that I do, and I think the how and the what and the why are all connected. So I'm going to run through these fairly quickly: the who, why, what, and how, and hopefully it will be clear how they are all connected. In terms of the who, if you start at the bottom of this slide in my experience, and I apologize, this is a lot of text and I usually use a lot of images, but just throwing this at you. But my 25 years in media and arts activism for social change on a community level is really the foundation of my thinking and my work. And I'm personally, I'm a very experiential learner. So this is how I learn. That was followed by 20 years of consulting practice across the United States. And then blending into teaching. And believe it or not, and it was a shock to me to put this down on paper, I teach for 6 different institutions right now at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD and professional levels. And of course, they're adjunct or part-time work. But it gives me many different vantage points and experiences to see how people learn differently in different places and at different sort of levels of coming into the practice. So in terms of the why, for the practice, in this is, you know, my personal why, and it was really rather quickly over the last week assembled, so it may evolve. But in terms of the practice, to prepare and equip leaders to facilitate and advance change that brings about more equitable, highly functioning place-based communities. And in terms of the pedagogy, my approach and belief is how you teach is what they learn, as much or more than what you teach. It's kind of like in art making, in my experience, process is often product and sometimes more important than product. And in the sort of parental approach, to do as I say, not as I do, which doesn't usually work very well. So then thinking about the what. And I like to start, and I apologize that I meant to begin my own presentation with an acknowledgement of the land that I live on and work on and occupy right now, which is in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or currently known as Minneapolis. And it's the traditional homeland of the Dakota people who were forcibly removed, many killed, and many still live here and are neighbors on this land. But I like to begin the approach, at least in the United States, about understanding the land on which we sit and the forces that brought it to be what it is presently. I also like to interrogate the term creative placemaking. Many people do that and has many variations, all of which are problematic. But I think it's important just to make that part of the learning process, that we're always interrogating the assumptions. It's also, I think, very important, again, in Western settings by and large, to understand colonialism and the sort of Western thinking of dominating the natural environment, that humans are somehow superior or have the right to control or dominate or modify the natural environment. So this decolonization as well as depatriarchalization is fundamental in the how of what I like to teach. I really like the idea of place knowing and deeply understanding the uniqueness of every place. And also very important to approach the Marxian ideas of alienation and privatization that are forces that are at work, and the implications of capitalism. Because when we're talking about place and land and real estate, and this idea of ownership of those things, capitalism is just a massive force that we have to try to get our head around in order to understand the dynamics. And also this drift towards individualism versus collectivism, at least in Western settings. I find it's different in the East, but it makes the work of working in community that much more difficult, because people are more concerned about the individual and not about the whole. Continuing on, I have 12 of these. Also, I think very important, the power of stories and narratives and names and words that we use. And they're very powerful, and they're very important to interrogate. The design is the power in design and the built environment and the messages that are built into these, including, you know, Zoom. That's part of the built environment. And also, and particularly, how white spaces are made, purposefully or not. We're often in this work replicating spaces for white people, and in a multi-ethnic, multicultural environment or world, we're defeating our own goals at times by not understanding that. And also, I'm a big proponent of asset-based thinking and strategies in community building, and also to stress iteration, that the roadmaps, the models, they're not readily at hand, or they're not clear because of the uniqueness of every place. And that this work is cross-sector, of course, and I often find people in the arts particularly need to get out of their silo, and think about the whole more than the one narrow interest. And finally, and not the least, integration of democratic practices and principles in the work. I think it's our responsibility to promote those in every way possible. So how we do the work is the work we're doing. That's my approach. So bridging to the how, and these are things that I strive to do, but they're not always easy, because we're fighting against our own ways of understanding teaching and the environments in which we exist, and students and others have a certain expectation or understanding. So how do we break some of those down? This is part of the unlearning, I think, in this work. But drawing on the assets of each individual in the class, that's relatively easy to do, and makes the class more enjoyable. Integrating artist creativity and cultural practices in the learning process, also very critical if that's the work that we're doing in community. Demonstrating equity and shared leadership in the classroom, because that, again, is the work in the community. Co-creating and iterating the learning environment, particularly difficult when you have to submit a syllabus for committee approval to have your course approved. How do you co-create? Iterating is possible to some degree, but co-creating is tough. But there are small ways that we can do some of these things. Accommodating diverse learning styles, again, easier said than done. And it's hard to understand everyone's learning style. Building democracy into the working classroom. You know, again, that's like co-creating the learning environment. Easier said than done, but a goal nonetheless. Critiquing, making that ideas that are critiqued, the classroom spaces themselves, the reading, critiquing the teacher. I find that art students are really good at critique, and they're not too shy at critiquing the teacher. My students in China, on the other hand, they wouldn't dare critique the teacher. So, you know, we work in different spaces. And finally, balancing theory, stories, experiences in place, collective work, discussion, visits to places, so that there's not just sort of one approach. Just to share a few images from some of my classes in teaching, we're talking about municipal systems. We have to, when we're meeting in person, go to City Hall, bring artists into the classroom, visit community sites, of course. And more challenging, but this is a lot of fun for me, was adapting a formal classroom to activate students through the work and in the community. And 2 years now teaching in China, there's no more formal classroom that I've seen than in Chinese universities. Very formal. They're accustomed to being lectured to for hours on end and then taking a test. So how to disrupt that space, spaces which are hard to, you can't move the furniture around or anything. But the students were amazing, were willing to get up and move and share with one another. They were shy at first, but then took to speaking in front of the class. Amazing at self-organizing and doing teamwork, visiting sites. This map in the center, the 8 different locations around Beijing that the students this most recent summer visited in teams of 6 and 7 students who self-organized, took on different leadership roles in the process, talked with people, assembled incredible information and reports that they then shared back with others. So the collectivism and ways of working together are so much different than American students anyway. And even teaching online, which this most recent summer was teaching online, the students responded and were willing to break up the formal classroom in some ways. It was very gratifying for me and a lot of fun. So that's some of my thoughts on, I don't know how much time I took, but hope not too much, on my approach and some of my experiences in teaching this work. And in terms of a question to hold and move forward that Cara asked that we think about, one I have, and it can be directed at students, can be directed at teachers, can be directed at institutions, is if this work is cross-sector, cross-disciplinary, how do we bring together people in space to learn together, to do this work together? And universities are so siloed in terms of their disciplines and structures. So many of the systems we deal with are that way. And how do students feel being in a space with others who are outside their realm of expertise, as well as teachers and the institutions? That's my question rolling forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's really fascinating to see. I've heard you talk of the work in China. It's really lovely to see those images of it. And I've done work in Japan, and I do appreciate that it's a very different sort of critical framework that you can work. It took some getting used to, for me certainly. And thank you for your question. That's a really important one. And talking to the structures that are around us too. We'll go over to Anita now, who has been working on some fascinating, brilliant projects with young people. So Anita, do you want to start to share your slides?
Can everyone see okay? Yeah. So following on, I could connect to a lot of what Tom was saying, but often coming from very different perspectives. Just to give a very brief, my way into placemaking, I grew up in the 70s in Northern Ireland. So in a segregated community where the most political question sometimes you could ask someone was, where are you from? Because as soon as you said where you were from, there was a whole string of information and assumptions that came with it, because 90% of the people lived in either all Catholic or all Protestant communities. The schools were and still are, for the most part, segregated. So this was my kind of background. I was very lucky. I had a dad who was a socialist, and my mum who was Salvation Army, but was also one of the peace women in Northern Ireland. So a softly political, but also quite deeply political. So I grew up very early on with this sort of inner, what do you mean no? What do you mean I can't go there? What do you mean you're creating this place? And that was something that had always kind of been there. I then ended up in the sort of 90s and 2000s in London and had the whole creative class and artists being into that space. I'm an artist first and foremost. Living in Southeast London, where there was 150 languages spoken in our community. It was also, we had Greenwich sort of to the right of us. Now, for anyone that knows, Greenwich is the royal borough of Greenwich. So you had all the palaces, but Deptford was the dockyard. That was where all the boats were built. And so you had a very interesting kind of side by side. So I guess in terms of placemaking, I was always interested in how can it be equitable, who's not at the table, how can we open up these voices, etc., etc. So that's just a very brief background. I'm actually going to talk about the piece that's in the book, which was around Codes Res. Codes Res was a research project, but essentially it was looking at transferring critical praxis, just applied theory, framework and suite of tools that I developed for creative placemaking, somewhat out of my frustration at how artists were often brought into the process for their process, and then the process was kind of stymied because of people's agendas and politics. I was also very concerned about younger artists coming into this space who may be, oh, I'm just here to make the art. I'm not political. And it's like, there is nothing more political than place, you know? So there was a lot going on, shall we say. So then I began to realize that this critical praxis was, yeah, you know, it was well and good, but I wanted to try as much as I could make myself redundant. So it was, how could we take this practice and make it more accessible to the most people? What would happen if we tried to do that? So there was a team of us and we were working simultaneously in post-primary education, so 11 to 18, as well as community. So formal and informal, but even within the post-primary, it was somewhat informal because we have this amazing opportunity in Ireland called transition year. We have 2 exam cycles, one in 3rd year and one in 5th and 6th year. Transition year is an optional 4th year where there's no curriculum. So there's an opportunity for project-based learning. However, the reality of doing that for teachers who are still committed to teaching other years within the system and within the class was quite difficult. So our team, we took 3 double classes a week, 3 different groups, and we started exploring how they would respond to a place-based approach that sort of grounded them in their location, but still gave them enough support where they were set up for success. Because one of the things I resonated with Tom's was in terms of highly structured. By this point, we could already see that the students, although only 15, had had 9 years of where they wanted a right answer. For them, you know, they found our process quite difficult in the beginning because it was like, the problem with this class is there's no right answer. It's always more questions. And I was like, yeah, that's right. And I will, if you ask me a question, I will probably ask you another question because I need more information. So that was quite difficult for them to sort of explore. On the other side, within the community, we're living in a rural coastal community. It has a lot of challenges, and one of the biggest is the outward migration. And people go off, they learn skills, they work with organizations, but they never come back. So all that knowledge is lost. You then also have a community where the knowledge is somewhat implicit. So being able to bring that knowledge out from the community for the benefit of the community was something that I was really particularly interested in. So just to give a little bit of an overview, the creative practice has sort of 4 key areas. It was a hack of permaculture, which some people know for growing food, but actually it's an ecological design system. So I took it and kind of deconstructed it and then rebuilt it for maybe a situated art practice initially. And then this 2-year project was a hack of that hack, if you like, and trying to break it down. It has 4 key areas, and essentially what it does, the tools support, they're like provocations to help you read a whole system across the politics, the economics, the culture. They have different ways of working that bring more people into the conversation. And that way you're really starting to look at not only the system as it is and see the hidden, but also then see where the opportunities are for intervention. So it's very much about encouraging and supporting self-organization and supporting communities to build relationships. We have a life cycle analysis. So you're really looking at what resources are already existing that could be used differently. One of the things Cara asked us to think about was the learning and unlearning. Part of this process is about unlearning the dominant narrative, about unlearning what you think your place is like through the shared and collaborative discussion and the different activities of others. So that's kind of very much the sort of overview of the practices. And I'm just now going to show you 2 examples that are kind of practical. So this is just an example of one of the modules. One of the things we wanted to do, we could see very early on that the teachers within the school, often they'd think, yeah, great transition year, we want to do a project, brilliant. And they'd taken off the PEG project, but these projects weren't scaffolded. They weren't scaffolded for teachers, and they certainly weren't scaffolded for students. So one example was, the outcome was create an effective awareness campaign. I know people that are paid hundreds of thousands of euros for that, and suddenly they're expecting a 15-year-old who has had the last 3 years of where they have 2 options to speak in class, to either say they know the answer or say they don't know the answer. And they're certainly not going to say the second one if they can get away with it. Because a bit like what Tom was saying in terms of maybe structure, there's at that age particularly, speaking out even is an issue. Sharing your opinion, they're wanting a right answer and you're asking them for an opinion. This is really hard. So we could see a lot of these issues. So the lesson plan, they're heavily scaffolded so that the teachers can also feel supported in delivering this new way of working. On the right, you'll see one of the worksheets for the students. One of the things we looked at was, because of this speaking out, so we have them work in 2s, then we have them work in 4s, then we have them swap their answers so that whatever they're feeding back to the group, nobody knows whose work it is. And so we're constantly trying to build up safety. And this was interesting. You know, some of people may know myself and Cara working on a new project around trauma and how we operate. What we could see very quickly was if we didn't do this scaffolding, they were already going into a shutdown and they couldn't then learn, you know, so this was very much how we structured. We have a whole number, they're linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, which for me is a little bit of an oxymoron, but they're actually a very useful tool because what they can actually help do is connect that link between local and global. They can learn in a manageable, tangible way about their place, explore, begin to create projects and go, oh, here's what the Sustainable Development Goals look like in my town. And then that can be used as a springboard for a bigger picture. And then just to finalize, we were working also with communities. We have a number of different projects, but this was just an overview of an introduction to a project that was looking at edible medicinal and what resources, what kind of food or edible medicinal resources are actually available within your local community. And then also how you might begin to explore those. The overarching one of this was they could, if they wanted, create a trail, like a kind of a trail through town, as a way of connecting in with the local kind of flora, the folklore, the culture, the heritage. So it's very open-ended ways for people to engage with. We also have a thing in Ireland called Tidy Towns, which is incredible. Every town has a Tidy Towns group. They're volunteers, and historically, that's what they did. They tidied the town and put up planters and whatnot. But now it's moving much more into biodiversity, localized resilience. So this was something that we thought could be shared with the Tidy Towns. We have a number of we have an engineering for good. So again, they were very much pick and mix. You can do the module, you can take lessons, you can take the structure, and it's very much built to adapt to suit. So that's just a little bit of an introduction into some aspects of the work that we've been doing in terms of teaching, learning and unlearning. And we very, very strongly encourage local faculty. And what we mean by that is just people in the community who have knowledge to share. One of the very important things for us was the whole research project. It was an embedded research project. I have worked often as an embedded artist. So as an artist doing research, it seemed obvious to me to do embedded research. So the whole research team and anyone else who became involved lived and worked full time in the community, even though our host institution was 300 miles away. And also we had within our budget where we could pay local faculty. And again, sometimes it was trading resources and skills. Sometimes it was a direct financial exchange. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Anita. You gave a really interesting story of the process there, but kind of knowing it behind the scenes, I don't feel that it was a linear process necessarily. So maybe that's something we can come back to as well, to consider perhaps some of the unexpected things that you encountered in that a bit. Lastly, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, just in terms of my question, it does somewhat follow on from Tom's, in as much as I'm working with communities, I'm working with post-primary, and I would really like to hear about or see or even consider how we move the universities, not even just from their own silos, to have more open channels, you know, where community and young people, it can be a much more fluid exchange.
Brilliant. Just making a note of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Jason in I'm going to say a faculty office. Would I be right there?
Yeah, it's sort of like a weird bag. Which
probably, you know, that emplaces you straight away. Thank you, Jason. Over to you.
Sure, I'm going to share my slides. So I wanted to talk a little bit about unlearning and not necessarily the mechanics of learning right now. And I wanted to start with a poem to just bring a little art into the room by Arundhati Roy, called "The Pandemic as a Portal." Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So, you know, I've worked in the creative placemaking field for a very long time. I was part of the team at the National Endowment for the Arts that kind of coined that term. I'm now in higher education, and I've literally had conversations in the last year about like everything we were doing was wrong, right? And we need to just completely rethink it. And so while I think we have done a lot and come a long ways in the last 10 years about strategies for teaching this knowledge, just building off of what Anita and Tom have said, I do think it's time for us to take a serious look at the content and the ways that we're working, and if they are fundamentally flawed because they are built on systems that were not just. And so I also think the pandemic is a huge opportunity for us to reinvent, because it is demanding that we change. I mean, like, everybody, my mom knows how to Zoom now. Like, the quote of this chapter in my life, if I ever write an arrogant autobiography, will be, "Mom, you're on mute," you know, just to joke what Tom was saying earlier, you know. So I just think it's really critical that we look at what's happening out there. And I wanted to show a couple examples that are sticking out to me, and recognize that we have to change both the way we're teaching technology-wise and the way what we're talking about. So a bunch happened in 2020. I mean, none of us want to remember it, but in a lot of the place-based stuff, I just wanted to point out a few things that happened in America that have been really interesting that I'm content-wise paying attention to. Streets are not just for cars in America anymore, right? I mean, this is not a new concept in somewhere like Italy, but in America, we have a very supremacist system of regulations that have regulated our streets, and it's shattered. And we are in kind of a gray zone around that now, and there's opportunity there. So how we talk about our physical infrastructure, I just wanted to point out, there's opportunity there to have a different conversation. To go along what Tom's been saying, there's never been more money for creative people than there is right now in the United States. It's coming out of governments and out of foundations. There's basic income programs happening. There's this Creative Builds New York, which is $125 million to pay artists to help rebuild New York City, to pay them jobs, to work in organizations to rebuild New York. This $15 billion that came out to support art venues in the United States, that is 3 times the size of the entire amount of money that our federal arts agency has ever given out in its 50-year history. In 1 year, we gave out that much money. So, like, don't tell me there's not assets, right? We always approach this work from a deficit-based perspective. What's wrong in a community? There's never been more money and more assets to work with. There's never been a more flexible moment. And people are combining public health and food and creativity in all kinds of interesting ways now. I really do feel like one thing we've under-talked about in the placemaking field is the connection to public health. And it couldn't even be a better moment to talk about that. And I'm really excited about the project that Anita and Kara are working on around trauma-informed placemaking, although I don't like that language, because we're living through a trauma right now. And the most important thing, at least in America right now, is the anti-racist frame as part of our efforts. And I think Tom touched on this quite a bit, and so did Anita. I got to recognize there's all white people talking on this panel, not a good thing, you know. We have not figured out in this field how to have the right voices in the room. A lot of the field of placemaking is built on structures that are built on white supremacy, right? And so how do we have whiteness without white supremacy? And how do we build structures? How do we take structures that were built on white supremacy and change them in fundamental ways, our teaching structures, our university structures, and change them in fundamental ways that not only look that clearly in the face, but also recognize that there are very different ways of interacting and teaching. And I think you can learn a lot from our Indigenous partners about how this can be taught differently, things can be taught and work differently. And I'm talking very high up. I just want to say, you know, yeah, talking about diversity, equity, inclusion is great. There's a fundamental challenge in the United States around race that we have to take on first. And we have not done that very well in this field. And a lot of the language and materials and funding lines were led by white people in the last 10 years. I was one of them, right? So we tried really hard to fix that and to get people in the room to change the conversation, but there's a ton of work to do there. So I would just say that. And I also think that so it's a real opportunity to just unsettle the orthodoxy, right? The pandemic is demanding it. We're getting new tools. I mean, Zoom is one point. This is the BlackBerry of this kind of teaching, right? You know, this was not built for higher ed. Someone wants to start a startup to build something better. It has access issues, right? For people of different ages and with money, you don't have money. So what are we all going to do about that? We have to you know, stare down the pandemic for exactly what it was and grasp this moment. And I just wanted to give kind of that light a fire under our butts a little bit about the future of this teaching, and to say, we need to listen. White people especially need to be humble and listen to other methodologies of teaching that are emerging from areas that and led by people of color, and take that seriously. There's something, if you don't know about it, in America called Dark Matter University, which is a collective of people of color who are working to sort of decolonize architectural and planning schools. We invited them to come teach our class, sold out here in a second. They taught it very differently than any white person would have taught it. So it's such a critical moment for us to figure this out. I don't think we have all the answers. We have to be kind of accepting of the fact that we're going to need to take risks and fail. But it is really time to unsettle our orthodoxies. So, I mean, my question is really that I'm trying to live with is, how do we create the space to unsettle the orthodoxies and take the risks and be okay if they fail, and be excited to try, right? Because I think and how do we carry as little luggage as possible? Okay, I'll stop there. Easy. Let's figure it out in the next 15 minutes.
We could do that, I'm sure. Absolutely. All of those were absolutely fantastic, and you can see. I can see a real sort of narrative thread going through all of those. I think the questions that you posed, Jason, are really urgent and really vital, and it was very much behind my thinking for this session, but I think for all of us around the handbook was, this is a moment to make placemaking really fit for purpose, and realising mistakes and lack and so on and so forth. And you'd hope as something which was a process-led kind of practice that there is space there for failure, but so often you see it sort of hemmed in by whatever forces might be around it. Anita and Tom, would you like, I think we need to stay with Jason's questions for a bit.
No problem.
Would you like to make a response to those? And obviously feel free to bring in examples as well that you've got to really enrich this.
Shall I go? Do you, Tom, respond? I think they're really pertinent actually for Ireland, because up until maybe 2000, maybe even late 90s, nobody came to Ireland. Ireland was very white. And I remember living in London and trying to explain the situation in Ireland. And I lived in, as I said, I lived in Deptford, very diverse community. The house that I lived in, it was a housing cooperative, self-managed. Our house, there was Paul, for example, who was from Jamaica, and B, who was from Africa. And as they were talking to me, they said, so how would we be accepted in Ireland? And I said, well, it would depend, are you a Black Catholic or a Black Protestant? And they kind of looked like, oh, and I went, yeah. I said, but it still has those kind of infrastructural, policies and protocols of other. Okay, the specifics may be different, but it operates kind of similarly. Just change out the specifics. This is something, since Ireland has become more economically attractive, this is something that actually is becoming more prevalent in Ireland. And I think, I think many of the younger people, because certainly in the Republic of Ireland, the schools are more integrated. So they're growing up, the next generation are growing up together. And I think in that level, someone mentioned intergenerational work. I think they, as educators, I think the next generation and the younger people who are developing these new skills, very agile as they go, I think they have a lot to share and to teach with us older people who are possibly more stuck in that older system. However, coming back to what I was saying, they themselves need support. They themselves need to be, it's not so much given permission, but to be supported, that they can have agency, that they can make change. One of the things that came out of our research, and it's very different, but 91% of our cohort were suffering from eco-anxiety, and they were talking about denial and talking about solutions. But when we talked to them, oh, so how's our work been? They said, you never left us in the problem. You helped us highlight and spotlight the problem. And then you also said to us, so what are we going to do about it together? And I think growing up in Northern Ireland, I know it can be difficult, and we have to create safety, and we have to create safe spaces. And this is a word that sounds quite strong, but I've always been, go to the point of conflict, because in that space, permaculture, the solution is in the problem. And I know that may sound quite naive, but actually this was one of the things that I was really keen in terms of placemaking and working with younger students. When I'm working with younger students that are wanting to go into this field, I'm advising them to go and, you know, get some conflict resolution skills, you know, non-incendiary, non-violent communication. I'm sharing links to stuff that, and this may surprise Tom and Jason, but I know from sometimes where I'm looking from, some of the most progressive radical work I'm seeing in America. So I'm directing students to, hey, look at this. We have a thing called the Global Goals case studies. And we, within that, select and share with our young people what other people are doing elsewhere. So really just trying to, you know, I know people talked about the global village, and I know that can be problematic, but really just trying to say to them, just because you don't see it in front of you doesn't mean it's not happening somewhere else. And
Can I ask
encourage.
a quick question, Anita. I mean, sorry to jump. I know Tom needs to jump in, but I have a question. So I totally agree with the, how do you create a safe space to have difficult conversations? Because I think that is, you know, making people uncomfortable, getting them into the conflict is one of our responsibilities as academics, to help them adult. I don't know if that's that's some, you know, just sort of a jokey term. So I wonder how you balance that in the classroom, right? I think it's the greatest challenge we have right now, because things are very heated in the States. With the whole cancel culture and all this stuff. And so how do you create that safe space for the uncomfortable?
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Or maybe Tom has answers.
Well, I wish I had answers. Am I muted? No, I'm not muted this time. I do wish I had answers, but some of the experiences I've had, and it's only recently that I've taught in an art school environment, and creating a safe space in which to fail is one thing that those institutions are far better at doing, and the students are more comfortable in that environment. But one of the things in terms of the conflict conversation, and I'm as conflict averse as like anybody, you know, I don't like to get into it, but I know how important it is. And one of the ways I think that's easier to move into that is through stories. The power of the stories that we tell, and the individual stories. And now I'm reflecting on sort of my teaching things that I laid out before, and I failed to mention positionality and reflexivity as being central. That's why I start my classes with students with doing that. And for each of the students to tell a story, and there can be conflict, and there can be drama, and there can be challenges and all sorts of things in those stories, but stories are just a wonderful way to approach that, and even being in a conflict and getting out of it, or resolving it, or moving it forward. Again, stories, I think, are such powerful ways to do that, because we don't have to, you know, confront, you are evil, I am bad, you are bad. You know, it's here's a story about something that has some kind of resolution or ends with some kind of a way to challenge us to move forward. So those are some of the things. And I think also because we have the opportunity of a classroom environments, however we define classroom, whether it's virtual, whether it's a physical space or kind of a hybrid kind of a thing where we're out in community working together. But creating a more level playing field. I mean, I hate grading, and some students get so obsessed over grades, and it's just like, and then this whole thing about rubrics, and they want these rubrics that like detail grade, you know, specifically what success looks like and all that. And oh, I hate that. And I just want everybody to go and do things and try things and reflect on their learning. So I mean, so I think we can, in small ways in classroom, we can create those kinds of spaces that are more egalitarian, that are safer, where failure is like a really wonderful opportunity for learning. And you know, we're up against a big system and a long-term culture of, you know, that push and pull between success and failure. But in our small ways, I think we can help students, young people, and ourselves even sort of let go of some of those that tension.
Yeah, I think a lot about what I learned living out in Arizona. When I was out in Arizona, the largest minority population after Latinos is Indigenous people. And so Indigenous culture permeates much more of the society there. And it's a completely different paradigm, right? It's not, they don't live in the same time frame as us. They don't live in the universe in the same way we live in the universe. It's not about an individualism at all. It is all about the collective. It is about what we are collectively doing. It's about, there's a respect for aid. I mean, and the way that our Indigenous teachers taught so differently and had skill sets that we all need as a society, and we're so generous about it. They'd be like, "What? We've been doing this for years. We actually know how to do this, and if you just ask, we'd help you." You know, I feel like, you know, I was like, "Oh my God, that's so perfect," you know. And so, you know, there's some real modesty that we have to have as a society, that there are people that do know how to do this differently and are living it differently and are doing very good at it. And it's there for the learning from. And I think that especially for communities that have access to that, like in the States, I'm talking from, I know from a hyperlocal, in the States is a very large perspective. You know, there are solutions out there. Anyways, and you sparked that for me, Tom. Sorry.
And Anita, one thing I saw that I think is very important for all of us to think about how to do, and I saw it on one of your slides, it was about empathy. Like, how do we teach empathy, or how do we, you know, project and help people grow that skill? Or
so I think it's interesting because I really listening to the two of you talking. So myself and other members of my team are also narrative for change facilitators, which is very much about storytelling. And I would agree, stories are very human. You know, stories are places, if you like, that we can share. And we can sort of start with very simple stories, building up. And for anyone who doesn't know, the narrative for change process is you partner up and each of you tell a story, and they can be themed, and they can start very small and very mundane, and then you can get deeper and more complex, more you know, kind of into bigger issues. But they're about listening and telling your story. So one partner will tell their story and the other one listens. And then the one who is listening tells that partner's story back to the group. So you have things like witnessing, testimony, validation, and then you can scale it up where people become more comfortable with telling bigger stories. I was also listening to what Jason was saying in terms of the Indigenous knowledge. Ireland has a huge Indigenous knowledge in our folklore and in the language. And we're trying to bring that back in, because a lot of our place names really tell the story of the place. And when you see the sort of phonetic Anglicization, it's like, but that means nothing. You know, so again, we use those sorts of things, and we bring in kind of elders from the community to kind of share that story. We also look at, in terms of with empathy, we have a lot of sort of exercise that we might start them, you know, if we give them little scenarios, you know, to get them thinking about the user needs, for want of a better word. So if they're designing for something or considering doing something, the first stage is pulling out the critical details from the profile. We then take them into a next stage of into their own project. So we would start with creating scenarios for them to get used to the empathy, then get them into thinking about their user and what they think, what they feel, what they might be listening to. And we also, again, Tom, I come from an arts background, so I can really relate to what you're saying, in as much as we have a lot of other skills coming from performance, coming from theatre, coming from that we can bring in to set up these spaces where other things can happen. And we also, at the beginning, we try and have a discussion about creating a consensus on what our roles are. How are we going to work together? And that way, what then begins to happen is you've set a sort of a safe boundary. When you come into this space, when you come into this, whatever it is, there will be things you have to leave at the door. And we encourage them to be open, respectful, mindful. And then, of course, sometimes things do, you know, it's life, we're emotional, things do. And then we'll just kind of have to take a time out and we'll have to think back. But what often happens then is, because you've set up the consensus with the group, they themselves begin to say, hey, we agreed that wouldn't happen. Or we agreed that would do that. So that's probably a very long-winded way of answering and responding to both of you. And it's,
yeah, that reflects back on the sort of co-creating the learning environment and so on. I stories are places. I'm going to borrow that. Thank you.
you're very welcome.
I like that.
It just came from listening to you. I mean, it's not a concept I thought about before. It was just in my response to you. It was like, okay.
we have a really interesting project here called the Writers' Room that we do a lot of work in it is actually in our community-based learning center, and they do a ton of community-based work through, they're working on a whole housing project, and it's all through writing. So I'm happy to connect you to that work. I mean, I know there's probably questions from the crowd that we need to get to. I just wanted to dwell on this idea of elders and culture bearers and their role in the classroom, and the transition that's happening right now, and the loss we've had. I mean, we've lost 600,000 people in the United States, quite a few of whom were culture bearers for our country and our places. And I'm not sure as a generation that we're doing the greatest job handing that knowledge off, you know? And so I'm curious about how you two use, I mean, it sounds like you, Anita, directly engage with some of those folks. Sorry, the term culture bearer means it's a person who sort of holds the culture for a place. And we know that places change over time, but I'm curious about how you're thinking about that transition, how you bring that into the classroom. I'd love to hear you speak about that. I mean, I'm fascinated about this Irish example, and I'd love to hear how Tom does it, because I'm sure he does too. So.
And that feeds into one of the questions, I think, that talked about heritage. I was just looking, because I think one of the things, like if we're working, we've even done some work in primary schools. So we very much sort of scaffold into our process that that they interview, that they go and talk to people in their community, that they talk to their grandparents, that they talk to elders, that they talk to really get, and we forefront their expertise. You know, we really kind of try and encourage them to understand that there's a wealth of knowledge and information in these people. And it's really important to gather that knowledge. But equally, I think we try to very sensitively encourage that sometimes the knowledge may be a little bit out of sync with where we are now in the 21st century. And that's where the young people can kind of bring their expertise. So the intergenerational collaboration of the wisdom with the more contemporary, maybe, you know, of how things are working, that can form a really strong, you know, kind of source for them building the next. And we're always trying, you know, we're always trying to say that there is a fluidity, that things change, things are dynamic, but at the same time, you see, I'll give you a little example. So in the Irish language, things like tired, hungry, those sorts of things, they're not existential. It's not I am. They come upon you when they move on. So they're very transient. So in a way, in our cultural psyche, we have this dynamism. And I think we try and encourage them to think of the two spaces, you know, that yes, things are moving and changing, but at the same time, there is a through line from the past to the present to the future. And that there's a value, and it just may need reimagined or, you know, kind of remixed even. So that's part
You're
of.
so bad at that in the States. All that youth culture, you know.
And well, I mean, the environment in the US is a bit different in that there are so many people from so many places in different parts of the world who are bringing their histories into the spaces too. So to both appreciate and value the land and the place and its history, but to also acknowledge and honor the multiple other histories of the people in the room, it's pretty complicated. And I mean, one of the things that in teaching that I try to do is having students reflect on their own understanding and relationship to place in their history as a child. Who were the people? What were the cultural influences? So that's you know, often a writing exercise. In fact, I had the Chinese students do that, and they were brilliant. Their writing in English is better than American students. And that, I think, helps then to understand, once you get that sort of, you know, reflexivity going on, to then better understand the place you're in now and how you relate to it, and how different people in the room have different ways of relating to those places and those histories. And also, I mean, I use cultural asset mapping, and make it participatory. I mean, both in the classroom, but also in community consulting work that I do. And so that process of people getting together to start to map out those histories and stories and places and things of meaning in their world and their environment is another way to bring that conversation into the room, and I hope foster that broader appreciation of others' stories as well as one's own history.
Yeah, I'm just looking at about unlearning and knocking out the old bad ways. I think I'm interested in, because, you know, as I said, I started out with the dominant narrative. A little bit coming back to, you know, the solution is in the problem. I see perhaps things that, you know, are destructive or inequitable or whatever as a great opportunity for springboarding. Okay, so what do we need then? What is problematic about this? How can we learn from this? You know, and again, at times I'm working with a very particular age group, so you might just get the, well, you know, so maybe that even for us, gives the answer, because we're always having to find ways to get over that, you know, which then might actually be helping us to find new ways of dealing with some of these more complicated, difficult, or inequitable situations.
I think that's right. I also think that it's about the lived experience and the voice in the room, right? Like, I think every college right now in America is struggling with the fact that they need to decolonize their curriculum. There's plenty of bazillions of facts out there. One of the worst is, you know, in the entire history of the United States, less than 500 African-American women have gotten their architectural license, right? So you think there's a problem with that curriculum? They think Black women feel like they belong in the architectural curriculum. Fact. But because the system is so broken, we don't necessarily have the voice in the room that know how to fix it. And so things like Dark Matter University are really happening, where we can literally pay people to be in the room and help us rewrite the curriculum. But and that is a real struggle right now, is that the folks don't have the lived experience to be able to actually change the curriculum. They're very intimidated to have to change the curriculum because it's way outside their knowledge zone, and they don't have the lived experience. And I mean, I'm going to say something. I'm a gay man, and I don't know why I like to use the Wizard of Oz as a metaphor, but I do. So it's just, maybe that's in my DNA. But like, if, you know, the Emerald City is our anti-racist party we all want to be at, you know, like, where are the people on their journey, right? Are they at the Scarecrow? Are they at the Cowardly Lion? Are they in the poppy field? Or is it like a sunny day back in Kansas, you know? And we have to, because so many people are on different parts of that journey, and their understanding of that work, that are working in the teaching system, part of our job is to help people start that journey, like at least light a tornado and get them some ruby slippers. I can kill this metaphor if you'd like me to. So I can run it all the way into the ground. Yeah. So, I mean, part of it, it's not just like they had to go to training, they've got to get some lived experience and get into the room and get in those uncomfortable conversations about what they know and don't know. And they also have to be in a safe space to do that. So you're actually like trying to solve this problem of getting it into the curriculum, but you don't actually have the humans to do it with. And you need to be sympathetic to the fact that they have grown up in a system that has not given them that space to do that. And I think everybody's struggling with that right now across the United States. Everybody is. And so, you know, I think that we will see progress. We will see, but I think it's going to be slow for those reasons, right? Yeah. And I think there's methodologies that we can all use, but at some point it's just like, not a lot of the people that are standing in front of the classroom have walked in the shoes in the right way. Do you know what I mean? And I'm very sympathetic to people who have not, the tornado has not hit yet. And I know that they want to do it and they don't know how. And so that's, I mean, like, the struggle is real with that right now in higher ed in America, at least. So did that make sense? Or was that just a metaphor that didn't make any sense?
I think that makes a lot of sense, because it's sort of that, you know, the old thing I think of, you know, that's coming up, which is entirely different, but it's can't get a job without experience, can't get experience without a job. Right. You know, and it becomes this kind of stasis thing. We have, and are still striving and increasing to try and look at team teaching, you know, where you could have, you know, you'll have the people that are, you know, maybe more conventionally qualified, and then the people that are qualified through their lived experience, and trying to bring them together so that they can support each other.
Yeah, and I think we need to get better at recognizing lived experiences as valuable as work experience or some other kind of research experience. And that is something that a few colleges have actually really cracked in America, like when they're hiring tenure track faculty. I'm sorry, I'm getting into boring mechanics of higher ed. Would anybody like to take a nap now? Because I'm going to talk about the mechanics of higher ed. So, but like literally getting into the HR stuff and saying this many years work experience, lived experience, is just as valuable as somebody who's written 3 papers about it that, you know, maybe 5 people have read. So, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I have to say I'm quite lucky in as I'm quite lucky, but my friends call me the terrier, and it's not a Jack Russell. So, for example, just coming back to say with Codes Res, the whole team I'm the only one that has a PhD. A lot of the team only have undergrads, some of them didn't at all. And I brought them in and I fought for them, and I wrote to HR and wrote why they should be brought in. I brought them in at level 8 research assistants, and why they should be, and validated what their experience was. And I say I'm lucky because the institution went with it. You know, and that's amazing, not just for the project and our immediate needs, but for me, it's amazing because that's a precedent that other people in Ireland who want to try and do similar things can actually, you know, kind of cite. And, you know, I'm very, very proud to say that it was selected by the Royal Irish Academy for climate and biodiversity as a case study in co-design and sustainability and embedded research. It didn't make it an easier project. It is something that I want to revisit because, you know, with a lot of research projects, you're kind of hyper focused on the key deliverables. But I actually think on reflection, this was another thing that we all did. Part of the methodology that I built that we were using, it actually has a phenomenological or lived experience log that I had every time we were doing something or acting as a practitioner, we had this reflective log on our lived experience, going through what it was like in the classroom, connections we made, different things like that. And I feel it's something that I'd really like to go back and look at, because there was a lot of learning and a lot of insights, particularly in terms of, you know, when you're in a higher institution or funded. I mean, we were funded by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a state funder. So there's the harsh realities of the deliverables. You know, how you support a team who maybe haven't come through an academic way to be able to contribute to what is normally quite a standard, whatever, at the same time as pushing the agency to understand that just because it didn't look like a conventional paper, it didn't mean that the knowledge held within it or the presentation or the form of the presentation wasn't equally as valid.
And back on the mechanics of higher education, in my role at the University of Minnesota, I hire the adjunct faculty for our Little Masters program in arts and cultural leadership. And over the years, I've now have almost all people of color in the adjunct teaching roles. Of course, these are like, you know, low paid, no benefit. so that's the, you know, the entry point. But it's just one of those contradictions of like, well, gee, we can bring in people of color into teaching, but they're going to get paid, you know, like a fraction of what they're really are doing. Yeah. So Tom, are there questions we need to get to?
I think we've covered most things in the chat and the Q&A. Anita's done quite a good job of mopping up everything. The thing, obviously, I've been a student recently learning about placemaking. I think it's been touched on a little bit, but the role of the classroom, and almost when we're talking about placemaking, the limit of the classroom, because when we're talking about placemaking, I think it's a very creative process. And you learn a lot by doing it or seeing it in action. And it would just be interesting to hear people's approaches to that, and whether you've taken students out of the classroom to do it, and how that's gone down. Really, is one of my thoughts.
I think the danger of teaching this is for it to be transactional with the community, right? That you go in and come up with ideas as a class. I mean, there's a whole thing in America about that communities that have been over-researched, right? You know, like, and how you can fight back against being researched from a classroom. And so ways we've thought about it is, what if we are dedicated to one community for 5 years, right? And they know they're going to be working with different sets of classrooms. They're going to propose problems they want us. We do it on a problem-based model, right? After they've had some basic training in the work, the students then go and try to help come up with solutions towards problems identified by the community itself. And so that's how we get out of the classroom. It has to be done extremely carefully. The professors that do that very well. But just last week, I had some folks who were like, we're going to go out and look at this building that we're going to like have students do proposals for. And it was in like this neighborhood right next door to us. And we were like, so you're just going to march a bunch of students down a neighborhood street and look at a building and not tell them you're coming? And like, don't you think that might freak some people out? You know what I mean? So I mean, just, I think there's some ethical things there to sort through. But I do absolutely think that the more you can bring the outside world into the case studies, the better, because it just makes it more real. Last thing we want to go back to the 60s where we're teaching people like, I shall come up with the idea in my bubble and you shall do it, we shall do it, and tear down neighborhoods and all that crap. So
what I've changed my outcomes, in at least the class I'm teaching at the University of Minnesota, or I actually co-teach, is not to create solutions, but to design a facilitative process to engage people. So it's, it's 2 or 3 steps back, but and more challenging, I think, for the students than for them to just go say, oh, we should change this street pattern, we should put this building and create this festival and blah blah blah. It's like, you have no place to go and tell a community they should do those things, but can you come up with a way to engage people in a co-creative process? And that's a lot of the students struggle. Some have been great, they've come up with some really wonderful ideas, but I think that's what I think their role, how they need to approach their relationship in community.
I think for us, because we're working with much younger students in a way, we have different things, but again, it's very much I think we do encourage them to be engaged with their community, but we try to do that with sort of, I guess, in-service kind of learning. So trying to pair them with community groups and organizations, and the community groups to say, we have this problem, and that becomes the sort of problem-based approach for the students. And because we, first phase is, we use a lot of design thinking as well. So first phase is empathy. It's really, let's think this through. And as I said, we have some different stages we do. And then the next thing that we're encouraging them to do is to really define the problem. What they may think, or what the community may think is the problem, could just be a symptom. And in order to do that, they have to really, again, ask a lot more questions.
Right.
So we're very much like, although they may be heading at some point towards a solution, it's like questions, you just need to ask more questions, learn and understand as much as you can before you make a mark. And sometimes when working with an intervention, and this is hard, sometimes the best thing is to do nothing, because the little intervention you may make could cause much worse. And it's being able to understand that, and then they might have to go back to the beginning again and start again, because maybe the intervention they were thinking about is too problematic. Yeah,
I mean, I think those critical analysis skills of seeing where the problem really may be coming from are really important. At the same time, well, being a Libra and always finding balance. I'm
a Leo, you can tell. You can tell this guy's a Leo.
And as I said in my presentation, I approach it with an asset-based lens and strategic thinking. So I think if students approach communities as if they're problems, oh, you have problems, you're a problem, we need to get deeper into your problem. That's their whole frame of reference of a community, is it's a problem. that can set the relationship off on the wrong foot, that can foster the community to be thinking, oh God, we have problems. but to also keep the assets in front of people too. It's like, what is it that is great about, what is it you do love about your community? How can we find a way to build on some of those things in order to overcome the problem? So it takes an analysis on both sides of the equation, I think, to build a more positive relationship in community too. Because if students go in and they say, there's some really cool things, there's some really wonderful things to like about this place too, and it does have a history of doing some things really well, and there are some problems. So anyway, that's kind of how I try to approach.
Yeah, I think that's really wise. And I would just say, you know, I think all those systems that we've been using and learning, like even design thinking, is being challenged as having emerged from white supremacy right now. I mean, I think that there's a lot of unlearning we as educators have to do of the stuff we have been using even, and see and listen to what the kind of challenges are that people have been putting forward about that. And I love the asset-based approach, but you know, I basically, I feel like everything that ways I'm working, I'm trying to stop and ask myself, put a frame around it and say, in any way, did that create something that was unjust, right? And am I miss it? Do I have a blind spot, right? And try to, because I'm finding that a lot of the things I thought were I mean, not a perfect human, you know, I have blind spots. So, but I do feel like a lot of those systems that emerged in the last 10, 20 years are of kind of teaching and the right way to do this, the right way to do planning, the pushback against all the modernism and all the things that we feel like we've been sort of iteratively adding to. There's been great challenges to even those iterations. And I think that that is very well said, challenges. And so I do think, you know, all of us pausing and still thinking about that too is important. I don't know why I'm babbling on about this, sorry.
I would agree. And, you know, I think when we're talking with students, we show them the tools, but we tell them, this isn't necessarily right. It's just a tool. It has its uses, but it has its limitations.
What's wrong with Facebook? No, I'm just kidding.
You know, one of the things we really, and this is like, because we have really some very foundational things, again, coming from the arts, you know, there's a lot of opportunities there. So we start with observation, and we start in one way, very, very simply, where we'll take them out and we'll get them to look north, south, west, and east. And we get them to draw in 2 minutes what they see, or make a sketch or a note or whatever. So we go right back to even that simple visual observation, audio observation, and really sensory observation, what they feel, what they look at, what they hear, and situate them in the physical space. So we're starting...
It's embodiment practice, yeah.
Right back, mindfulness embodiment, right back at the beginning. Me in this physical location, and we've realized, and talking about listening, you know, because we've realized, you know, a lot of you know, I do this myself, and you know, a lot of adults do this. When you live somewhere, you stop looking. It just becomes your background noise. You're over familiar. So we try to almost defamiliarize the familiar by getting them to really go in and look, and we sort of build that up. You know, it'll be a minute each direction, and then we'll say, okay, now go back again and pick something. You know, we even get them to do things where they have to draw by touch. They have to kind of close their eyes and try to draw. They have to draw with their left hand. They have to only draw the negative spaces. But we tell them, this is not about great drawing. We say very clearly, this isn't about representational. This is an experiential, you know, kind of process. Because again, trying to just, you know, the unlearn before then the next stage is, okay, now what happens if you're observing the place that you live beyond yourself? You know, what might someone else's experience of this be? So it's very staged, you know, little step.
Love it.
Yeah, I think it's really.
Sorry, I just want to make sure if there are any last things that we need to say, Tom, because I do have a 1:30. I'm sorry.
No, I think we're sort of there at a conclusion. I think there's more points that you and I had to ask, but that we've run out of time. So because I'd really like to pick up on Tom's point about grading and like grading placemaking. Like how do you go about grading placemaking? That's a really interesting point. But anyway, I think we'll have to finish there because we're coming up to past. So thank you very much to Tom, Jason, and Anita for your comments and discussion. It's been really great to have you on. So thank you very much, and I'm sure Cara will be delighted with the end product as well. So we'll put this on the YouTube channel for follow up. But thank you all, and thank you for participation as well from the audience. So thank you. Cheers, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good to see you.
Good night, guys.
Great.
I need a hug next time in person someday.
I really enjoyed it.